The year was 1874, and the sun was a hammer over the high plains. It beat down on the dust of the main street, on the bleached boardwalks, on the tired-looking buildings that sagged like old men. In the thin shade of the livery stable, a dog panted, its tongue lolling in the dirt. This was a town that knew hardship, a town where survival was a currency and dignity was a luxury few could afford. And on this day, dignity was in very short supply. Riding slow and steady into this cauldron of heat and quiet desperation was a man named Michel Boone. He sat tall in the saddle, his shoulders a bulwark against a world that had tried its best to break him. In front of him, clutching the saddle horn with hands no bigger than field mice, was his daughter, Annie. She was 4 years old, a tiny flame of innocence in a life that had been defined by shadow. For her, a trip to town was a grand adventure. For her father, it was a bitter necessity. He needed supplies, flour, nails, coffee, the simple things that kept a ranch from falling apart and a man from giving up. He hated coming to town. He hated the looks, the whispers that followed him like stray dogs. The town saw a widower, a man broken by grief. He saw only their judgment, and he wanted no part of it. He swung down from his horse, the leather creaking in protest. He lifted Annie to the ground, her little boots kicking up a puff of yellow dust. She grabbed his hand, a rough, calloused thing that had built fences and buried a wife. As they stood there, the window of the general store threw their reflection back at them. A man and a child. A picture with a missing piece, a hole where a woman should have been. Michel felt the old ache, the familiar nail of grief driven deep into his soul. He'd learned to build his life around it, but it was always there. He turned, pulling Annie toward the store, his face set like stone. And that's when he saw her. She was sitting on the edge of the boardwalk near the steps of the store, and she looked like a ghost. Her dress was the color of dust and sorrow, her hair a tangled mess, caught by the hot wind. She held herself strangely, with a kind of fierce, brittle pride, as if daring the world to shatter her completely. Beside her, an empty basket. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the noonday silence. "Bread," she said to a man who hurried past. "Please, just a slice." The man didn't even look at her. He just kept walking, his boots thudding on the wooden planks, leaving her words to die in the air. Michel stopped. Annie tugged at his hand, her big, curious eyes fixed on the woman. She was young, maybe not yet 30, but her face was a roadmap of hunger and sleepless nights. There was a beauty to her, not the kind you find in parlors, but the kind that's forged in fire, a resilience that refused to be extinguished even as shame and starvation did their level best. He didn't know her name was Rosie Dawson. He didn't know she was a widow, cast out and left with nothing after a misfortune the town loved to whisper about but never explain. All he saw was the raw, desperate edge of a soul about to go under. From across the street, a voice dripped with venom. "Begging again, is she?" It was Martha Consincade, the shopkeeper's wife, her face pinched into a permanent sneer. A disgraceful sight. Right out in the open. Another man chuckled, a low, ugly sound. Pretty face won't fill her belly. No place for her kind here. Rosie heard them. She always heard them. But she didn't flinch. She just swallowed, her throat painfully dry, and her gaze drifted across the street, finding nothing. "Bread," she whispered again, to no one. Only bread. Annie's small voice was a clear bell in the oppressive quiet. "Papa," she said, looking up at him, "she's hungry." And in that moment, something shifted in Michel Boone. He looked from his daughter's innocent face to the woman's desperate one. He saw the tremble in her hands she tried so hard to hide. He saw the hollows in her cheeks. He saw a woman fighting a war all by herself, and losing. He had come to town for flour and nails, but now he was here for something else entirely. Without a word, he turned and walked into the general store, the little bell above the door announcing his arrival with a cheerful, mocking jingle. The air inside was thick with the smell of coffee beans and kerosene. Martha Consincade stood behind the counter, her arms crossed, her eyes like chips of flint. Michel moved through the store with a grim purpose, grabbing what he needed. A sack of flour, a bag of nails, coffee. He put them on the counter. Then his hand hovered over the fresh loaves of bread stacked nearby. He picked up one. Then he picked up a second. Martha's thin lips twitched into a smirk. 2 loaves, Michelle? Your appetite's picking up. Her voice was an insult wrapped in a question. Michelle didn't answer. He never did. Silence was his armor. He paid his money, the coins clinking onto the wooden counter, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense quiet. He gathered his supplies, the 2 loaves of bread sitting right on top. He walked back out into the blinding sun. Rosie didn't look up. Why would she? No one ever stopped. No one ever saw her. She was just part of the dust, part of the scenery of suffering. But then a shadow fell over her. She looked up, startled, and saw him, the big, quiet man with the little girl. He was standing right in front of her. He knelt down, the joints of his knees cracking softly. Annie watched, her thumb in her mouth, her eyes wide. Michelle Boone said nothing. He simply took one of the loaves of bread, still warm from the oven, and placed it in her trembling hands. Their eyes met, and the world stopped turning. In her eyes, he didn't see a beggar. He saw a mirror. He saw a soul as wounded as his own, a heart that had been shattered and left to bleed out in the dust. This wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was something far deeper. It was recognition. Rosie's lips parted, but no sound came out. She stared down at the bread in her hands, her fingers curling around it as if it were a dream that might dissolve at any moment. The crushing weight of shame, the constant companion of her days, lifted just a fraction, enough for her to breathe. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the face of the man before her. But these weren't the tears of despair she had grown so accustomed to. They were something new, something she didn't have a name for. The whispers started immediately, slithering from the shadows of doorways and the far side of the street. Look at that. Michelle Boone giving bread to that tramp. He'll live to regret that. What's a decent man like him want with a woman like her? Michelle heard them, but he didn't turn. He didn't acknowledge them. He simply rose to his feet, gave Rosie a small, almost imperceptible nod, and walked away, his daughter's hand held tight in his. Rosie clutched the loaf of bread to her chest. Her hunger was a screaming beast in her belly, but for the first time in a long time, it wasn't the only thing she felt. Beneath the gnawing ache, a tiny warmth had begun to spread. It wasn't from the bread. It was from the silence of the man who had given it. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so quiet it was stolen by the wind. But Michelle heard it. He didn't look back, but he heard it, and a part of his own frozen heart cracked just a little. That night, back at his ranch, Michelle lay awake long after Annie had fallen asleep in her small cot. The moon threw silver bars across the rough wooden floor. He stared at the ceiling, telling himself it was just a loaf of bread. A simple act. It meant nothing. But it wasn't nothing. He couldn't get the look in her eyes out of his head. The raw, desperate hunger, yes, but underneath it, something else. A flicker of a fire that hadn't quite gone out. An echo of the woman she used to be. He had seen that look before. He had seen it in the eyes of his wife, Sarah, in the last days before she died. The wind rattled the windows, carrying the ghosts of the town's whispers. But something else was in the air now. Something new. Something dangerous. A question had been asked with a loaf of bread, and Michelle Boone had a terrible feeling he already knew the answer. It wasn't a question of charity. It was a question of murder. The next few days passed in a blur of hard work and uneasy silence. Michelle mended fences, chopped wood, his body moving through the familiar rhythms of ranch life, but his mind was somewhere else. It was back in town, kneeling in the dust, looking into the eyes of a starving woman. A starving woman who wore the same haunted expression as his dead wife. It was a coincidence. It had to be. Sarah had died in a riding accident. A tragic fall. The whole town knew the story. She'd been thrown from her horse, her neck broken. It was clean, brutal, and simple. But was it? Late at night, when the only sound was the cry of a distant coyote, Michelle would unlock the small wooden chest where he kept Sarah's things. A pressed flower, a ribbon from her hair, and a small, leather-bound journal. He'd read the last few entries 100 times. They were filled with worry. Vague references to a bad business and a terrible mistake. She'd written about a man named Dawson, a man with a pretty young wife, Rosie Dawson. The whispers in town said her husband had lost everything in a foolish gamble and then taken his own life in shame. But Sarah's journal hinted at something else: a partnership, a secret, a betrayal. The thoughts gnawed at him, relentless and sharp. Annie, in her innocence, wouldn't let him forget. "Papa," she asked one morning, her voice small and serious, "is the bread lady still hungry?" Michel looked down at his daughter. "I don't know, Annie." But he knew he had to find out. He rode into town a week later, not for supplies, but for answers. He didn't see Rosie on the boardwalk. He asked around, his questions casual, careful. He learned she was living in a lean-to behind the livery, taking what scraps of work she could find. He went to the livery, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He found her washing filthy stable blankets in a tub of murky water, her hands red and raw. She looked even thinner than before, the bones of her face sharp beneath her skin. When she saw him, she froze, a flicker of fear in her eyes. He didn't say what he was thinking. He didn't ask about her husband or about his wife. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a sack of flour. He set it on the ground near her. "I have chores that need doing," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "Cooking, cleaning, tending to Annie. The pay isn't much, but there's food and a roof." Rosie stared at the sack of flour, then at him. She saw no pity in his eyes. She saw no kindness. She saw something hard and unreadable, something that made her shiver despite the heat. This wasn't an offer of help. It felt like a summons, a demand. Pride warred with hunger inside her. Pride told her to refuse, to spit in the face of this man's cold charity. But hunger was a more powerful master. And there was something else, too. A desperate, foolish hope that this was a way out of the hell her life had become. "I'll come," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. She arrived at the ranch the next day, a small, pathetic bundle of her belongings clutched in her hand. Annie ran out to meet her, squealing with delight, and for a moment a genuine smile touched Rosie's lips. It was a fleeting, fragile thing, like a winter sunbeam. Michel watched from the porch, his face a mask. He showed her to a small room at the back of the cabin. He laid out the rules, simple, clear, and cold. Do the work, earn your keep. No questions asked, and so began their strange, silent life together. Rosie was a phantom in his house. She scrubbed the floors until they shone, mended clothes with neat, invisible stitches, and cooked meals that filled the small cabin with the forgotten smells of home. She was quiet, efficient, and she never, ever met his gaze. But Michel was watching her, every moment, every gesture. He watched her hands as she kneaded dough, looking for a sign, a flicker of deceit. He listened to her soft voice as she told Annie bedtime stories, straining to hear a lie hidden in the fairy tales. He was looking for the truth about how his wife died, and he was beginning to suspect that the woman sleeping under his own roof was a killer. The town, of course, exploded with gossip. It was one thing for Michel Boone to give a beggar a loaf of bread. It was another thing entirely to bring her into his home. "He's lost his mind," Martha Consincade declared at the general store, her voice carrying to every corner. "Taking in that woman. It's a disgrace to his wife's memory. Mark my words," another woman added. "She's after his money. She'll bleed him dry and leave him with nothing." The poison of their words spread through the town, isolating the Boone Ranch even further. When Michel rode in for supplies, men who had known him his whole life would turn their backs. Women would pull their children closer, as if Rosie's presence at the ranch was a contagious disease. Michel ignored it all. He had a bigger storm to weather inside his own house. One evening, he saw it. Rosie was sitting by the fire, mending one of Annie's dresses. A thin silver chain was visible at the collar of her worn-out blouse. Tucked inside was a small silver locket. Michel felt the air leave his lungs. It was Sarah's locket. He knew it instantly. He had given it to her on their first anniversary. He could see the tiny distinctive scratch near the clasp. There was no doubt. He felt a cold, murderous rage rise in his chest. He wanted to stride across the room, rip it from her neck, and demand to know how she got it. He wanted to shake the truth from her. But he didn't. He clenched his fists until his knuckles were white and said nothing. He had to be smart. He had to be patient. A cornered animal is a dangerous one. His suspicion was no longer a vague fear. It was a certainty. This woman had been there the day his wife died, and she had stolen a locket from a dead woman's body. What else had she done? The question haunted him, turning his home into a prison, his every waking moment a torment. He was living with his wife's killer, and she was smiling at his daughter. A few nights later, another piece of the puzzle fell into place, and it was even more chilling. Annie was sick with a mild fever, and Rosie was sitting by her cot, humming a lullaby to soothe her. It was a strange, sad little tune, one Michel had never heard before. He was standing in the doorway, hidden in the shadows, listening. The melody was unfamiliar, but as Rosie hummed the last few notes, a cold dread washed over him. He stumbled back to the main room, his heart pounding. He went to the wooden chest, his hands shaking as he lifted the lid. He found Sarah's journal and flipped to the last page. Her final entry was short, frantic. He knows. Dawson knows I found the map. He was humming that terrible little tune. God help me. And scrawled beneath it, like a child's panicked drawing, were the musical notes of the lullaby Rosie was humming to his daughter at that very moment. The blood drained from Michel's face. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a mistake. This woman, this quiet, unassuming woman who baked his bread and cared for his child, was not just a thief. She was a monster. She and her husband had murdered his wife. The story about the riding accident was a lie. A carefully constructed lie to cover up a cold-blooded killing. And now the killer was living in his house, sleeping in the next room, winning the love of his child. He felt a wave of nausea. The stew she had cooked for dinner, the one he had just eaten, suddenly felt like poison in his stomach. He looked at his hands. They were trembling. He had invited the serpent into his garden, and he had no idea how to get it out. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. Michel walked through his life like a ghost, the knowledge he carried a toxic secret that poisoned everything. Every meal Rosie cooked, he forced himself to eat, wondering if this would be the one laced with arsenic. Every time she smiled at Annie, he saw the grin of a predator. He had to get a confession. He had to know the whole truth. But how? If he confronted her, she would deny everything. She would run, and the truth would be lost forever. He had to be smarter than her. He started dropping hints, small, sharp needles to prick her conscience. He would talk about Sarah, mentioning details of her accident. He would watch Rosie's face for a flicker of fear, a sign of guilt, but her expression remained a placid, sorrowful mask. She was good. She was very, very good. One evening, he decided to set a more direct trap. He sat at the table, cleaning his rifle, the lamplight glinting off the polished steel. "Funny thing," he said, his voice casual, but the air in the cabin crackled with tension. "The sheriff, back when Sarah died, he said it was strange. The way her horse bolted, almost like it had been spooked by something. Or someone." He looked up, his eyes locking onto hers across the room. Rosie didn't flinch. She just kept darning a sock, her needle moving in and out with a steady, maddening rhythm. "It was a terrible tragedy," she said softly, her voice filled with a perfect imitation of sympathy. He felt a surge of frustration. She was impenetrable, a fortress of lies. That night, his carefully constructed control began to crack. He fell into a restless, feverish sleep, his mind a whirlwind of Sarah's journal, the silver locket, and the haunting lullaby. He dreamt he was at the bottom of a ravine, looking up at Sarah's broken body. And standing over her were two figures, Rosie and her husband. They were laughing. He woke up with a gasp, his body drenched in sweat. His stomach churned violently, and a sharp, cramping pain seized his gut. He stumbled out of bed, collapsing onto the floor, his body racked with convulsions. Poison. The thought screamed through his mind. It wasn't in his head. It was real. She had finally done it. She knew he was getting close, and she was trying to kill him. He heard footsteps, and the door to his room creaked open. Through the haze of pain, he saw Rosie's silhouette in the doorway, a lamp held high. Her face was a mask of shadows. This was it. She was coming to finish the job. He tried to cry out, to warn Annie, but his voice was a strangled croak. Rosie rushed to his side, her eyes wide with alarm. "Michel, what is it? What's wrong?" He flinched as she reached for him, expecting a knife, a pillow to smother him. Instead, her hand was cool on his forehead. It was gentle. "You're burning up," she whispered. For the next 2 days, Michel drifted in and out of a delirious nightmare. He was vaguely aware of Rosie constantly by his side. She bathed his face with cool cloths. She forced sips of water between his cracked lips. She held his hand when the shaking was at its worst. He heard her whispering prayers, her voice thick with what sounded like genuine fear and desperation. In his moments of lucidity, he was more confused than ever. This wasn't the behavior of a cold-blooded killer. This was the devotion of a saint. Was this part of her act? A cruel, elaborate performance to make him lower his guard before she delivered the final blow? Or was he wrong? Had he completely, terribly misjudged her? The poison, the locket, the lullaby. It was all real. It had to be. But the woman nursing him back from the brink of death, the woman whose tears he felt fall on his hand in the dead of night, she couldn't be the same person. It didn't make sense. By the third day, the fever broke. He woke up weak and disoriented, but clear-headed for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Rosie was asleep in a chair by his bed, her face pale and exhausted. Annie was curled up on a rug at her feet. He lay there, watching them, his mind racing. He had been so sure, so certain of her guilt, but her actions had declared her innocent in a way no words ever could. So if she hadn't poisoned him, who had? And if she wasn't the monster he believed her to be, what was the real story behind his wife's death? The truth was still out there, buried in the past. And he realized, with a chilling certainty, that he wasn't the only one in danger. If someone had tried to poison him, it meant they were still in town. It meant they were watching. And it meant Rosie was a target too. He had brought her to his ranch to expose her as a killer, but now he had to protect her as a witness. The bond between them had changed. It was no longer the tense, suspicious arrangement of a master and a servant. A strange, unspoken connection had been forged in the crucible of his illness. He had seen a part of her soul, and she had seen his vulnerability. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Annie, with the simple wisdom of a child, gave voice to the change. One afternoon, as Rosie was hanging laundry in the yard, Annie tugged on Michel's sleeve. "Papa," she said, her expression serious, "you should keep her forever." The word struck him like a physical blow. Keep her? The woman he had suspected of murdering his wife? The thought was insane, but as he looked at Rosie, her back to him, the sun catching the stray hairs that had escaped her bun, he felt a pull he couldn't explain. He saw not a killer, but a woman of incredible strength and quiet dignity. A woman who had been through an unimaginable hell and had not only survived, but had found it in herself to care for him and his child. He was beginning to realize that the story he had constructed in his mind was wrong. Not just wrong, but the exact opposite of the truth. Rosie wasn't the villain in this story. She was the victim. And if she was the victim, that meant the killer was still out there. His gaze drifted toward the town, shimmering in the distance. The killer was there, hiding in plain sight, laughing at him, and at the center of the web, he was sure, was Martha Consincade. Her hatred for Rosie was too personal, too venomous. It wasn't just snobbery, it was fear. Martha was afraid of what Rosie knew. Michel knew what he had to do. He couldn't hide on the ranch forever. He had to force the killer out into the open. He had to go back to town and set a new trap. Not for Rosie, but for the real murderer. It was time for the final act. He chose Market Day, the busiest day of the week. The town was a swirling mass of people, wagons, and noise. He rode in with Rosie beside him, and Annie perched in front of him on the saddle. He could feel the eyes on them, the whispers that followed them like a foul odor. Rosie's back was ramrod straight, but he could see the tension in her hands as she clutched the reins. She was terrified. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice low, "no matter what happens." She nodded, her eyes wide and trusting. The trust sent a pang of guilt through him. She had no idea what he was planning. They hadn't even reached the general store when the attack came. "There she is!" Martha Consincade's shriek cut through the crowd like a rusty blade. She stood on the steps of the store, her finger pointing directly at Rosie. "The Dawson widow, the tramp who clawed her way into a decent man's house. Have you no shame?" A wave of cruel laughter rippled through the onlookers. People stopped what they were doing to watch the spectacle. Rosie froze, her face turning crimson. Shame, her old enemy, washed over her, and she visibly flinched as if she'd been struck. Annie whimpered and buried her face in Michelle's shirt. This was it. The moment of truth. For a long, agonizing heartbeat, Michelle did nothing. He let the silence stretch. He let the town's poison fill the air. He let them all see Rosie's humiliation. He needed them to see it. He needed the killer to feel confident, to feel victorious. Then he moved. He swung down from his horse and lifted Annie into Rosie's arms. He turned to face the crowd, to face Martha, and the silence he had carried for years like a shield, he now wielded like a sword. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not loud, but it carried an authority that silenced every other sound on the street. "That woman," he said, his eyes burning into Martha's, "has more grace and strength in her little finger than this entire town has in its rotten heart." A collective gasp went through the crowd. "She has cared for my child as if she were her own," he continued, his voice rising with a cold fury. "She nursed me back from death's door while you vultures were whispering your lies. She has brought life back into a house that was nothing but a tomb." He took a step forward, and Martha instinctively took a step back. "So hear me now," he boomed, his voice echoing off the false front buildings. "Her name is Rosie Boone. She will stand beside me from this day forward, and if any of you ever so much as breathe a word against her again, you will answer to me." The boardwalk was dead silent. Even the horses seemed to be holding their breath. Rosie stared at him, her breath caught in her throat, tears streaming down her face. No one had ever defended her. No one had ever spoken for her. What he had just done was more than a defense. It was a declaration of war. From the edge of the crowd, a figure stepped forward. It was Reverend Harlan Price, the town's preacher, his face grim. He had been watching, listening. "The law of God and man requires a bond," the Reverend said, his voice steady. "If what you say is true, Michelle, then let us bind what is already fact." And right there, in the middle of the street, under the harsh glare of the noon sun and the shocked eyes of the entire town, Michelle Boone took Rosie's hand. It was not a proposal born of love, but of strategy. It was a shield, a weapon. By making her his wife, he was giving her his name, his protection, his power. He was making her untouchable. He looked into her tear-filled eyes. "Rosie Dawson," he said, his voice now gentle, "will you have me?" She could only nod, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. The vows were short, spoken without ceremony, but every word was a stone laid in a new foundation. When the Reverend declared them husband and wife, a stunned murmur went through the crowd. Martha Consincade's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. The trap had been sprung. Michelle lifted Annie onto the horse, helped his new wife into her saddle, and they rode out of town without a backward glance, leaving a storm of confusion and fury in their wake. They were no longer a widower, a beggar, and an orphan. They were a family, and they were going home to uncover a murder. The ride back to the ranch was silent. The weight of what had just happened settled over them, heavy and profound. Rosie kept glancing at Michelle, her mind reeling. She was Mrs. Boone. She had a husband, a family. It was a dream, a fantasy she hadn't dared to even imagine, but she could see the look in Michelle's eyes. This wasn't about love, it was about something else, something dark and dangerous that had been set in motion in that town square. When they reached the cabin, he took Annie inside and put her down for a nap. Then he came back out onto the porch where Rosie was waiting, her hands twisting in the fabric of her dress. The time for secrets was over. "Rosie," he began, his voice low and serious, "we need to talk, about my wife, and about your husband." Fear flashed in her eyes. I don't know anything." "Don't lie to me," he said, his tone sharp but not unkind. "Not anymore. I know you were there." He took a deep breath. "The locket you wear, it was Sarah's. I gave it to her." Rosie's hand flew to her chest, her fingers closing around the hidden locket. The color drained from her face. She looked like a trapped animal. "And the lullaby," he pressed on, his voice relentless. "The one you hummed to Annie, Sarah wrote about it in her journal. The last thing she ever wrote. She said your husband was humming it right before she died." Rosie began to tremble violently, her carefully constructed composure finally shattering. Sobs racked her body, the terrible silent sobs of someone who had held their grief inside for too long. "It wasn't like that," she choked out between gasps. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand," he said, his voice softening. He sat down beside her on the porch steps. "Tell me everything. The truth." And so the story came pouring out, a story of greed, fear, and murder, far uglier than anything Michelle could have imagined. Her husband, Daniel Dawson, and the shopkeeper, Thomas Consincade, had been partners. Not in a gamble, but in a criminal enterprise. They were rustling cattle, altering brands, and selling them across the county line. But their real prize was land. They were using threats and forged documents to cheat smaller ranchers out of their property. Michelle's wife, Sarah, had found out. She was clever with numbers and had noticed discrepancies in the town ledgers. She had started asking questions. One day, she followed Thomas Consincade and saw him meeting with Daniel. She found their map, the one that detailed all the land they planned to steal, including a large parcel of the Boone Ranch. She confronted Daniel Dawson. She threatened to expose them both. "Daniel came home that night," Rosie whispered, her eyes distant, reliving the horror. "He was terrified. He said Sarah Boone was going to ruin them. He was humming that little tune. He always did that when he was nervous. He said he had to meet her, to try and reason with her." But Thomas Consincade had other plans. He didn't want to reason with Sarah. He wanted to silence her. "He followed Daniel," Rosie continued, her voice breaking. "I saw him. He had a rock in his hand. I tried to stop him, but he pushed me away. He spooked Sarah's horse. It threw her. She wasn't dead, but she was hurt badly. And then, Thomas, he used the rock. She couldn't finish. She buried her face in her hands. He killed her," Michelle finished for her, his voice a dead, hollow thing. "And your husband let him. He was a coward," Rosie wept. "Afterwards, Thomas gave me the locket. He told me to keep it, to remember what happens to people who talk too much. He said if I ever told anyone, he would do the same to me. And to Daniel. But Daniel Dawson couldn't live with the guilt. A few weeks later, he threatened to go to the sheriff. And Thomas Consincade couldn't allow that. He made Daniel's death look like he had taken his own life, and he used his wife, Martha, to spread the rumor that Rosie's shame had driven him to it. They took everything she had and cast her out, ensuring no one would ever believe a word she said. She was a beggar, a tramp, a crazy woman. Who would listen to her? The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place in Michelle's mind, forming a picture of pure evil. The public shaming, the whispers, the isolation, it was all a deliberate campaign by the Consincades to keep Rosie silent and terrified. And the poison. "The preserves," Michelle said suddenly, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization. "Martha gave me a crate of her canned preserves after Sarah died. As a gift. I've been eating them all winter." Rosie looked up, her face a mask of dawning horror. "I never used them," she said. "I always cook fresh. I thought they smelled off." It had been a slow, patient murder attempt. Thomas Consincade had killed his wife, killed his partner, and was slowly poisoning him to get his land. The rage that filled Michelle was a pure, white-hot fire. It burned away the last of his grief and left something else in its place, a cold, hard resolve. He had married this woman to protect her. He had defended her to set a trap. But now, standing there with the full, terrible truth laid bare between them, it was something more. They were two survivors, bound together by a shared history of pain and betrayal. They were the only two people alive who knew what Thomas and Martha Consincade had done. He stood up and reached for her hand, pulling her to her feet. "It's over, Rosie," he said, his voice like iron. "The hiding, the fear. It's over." She looked at him, her eyes still swimming with tears, but for the first time a flicker of hope ignited within them. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. He turned and looked toward the town. "We're going to get justice for Sarah. And for you." He walked to the barn and saddled his horse. This time, he wasn't just carrying a rifle. He was carrying the truth. And it was a heavier and more dangerous weapon than any gun. They rode back into town, not as husband and wife, but as avengers. The town was quieter now, the market day crowds having thinned. But as Michelle and Rosie rode down the main street, people stopped and stared. The news of the impromptu wedding had spread like wildfire. They saw the grim determination on Michelle's face, the newfound strength in Rosie's posture, and they knew this was not over. They rode straight to the general store. Thomas and Martha Consincade were inside. When they saw Michelle and Rosie walk through the door, their faces paled. Martha was the first to find her voice. "What is the meaning of this?" she snarled. "Get that woman out of my store." Michelle ignored her. His eyes were fixed on Thomas, who was trying to shrink behind the counter. "We need to talk, Thomas," Michelle said, his voice dangerously calm. "About a map and a lullaby." Thomas Consincade's composure shattered. His face, already pale, turned the color of ash. He lunged for a shotgun he kept under the counter, but Michelle was faster. He vaulted over the counter and slammed Thomas against the wall, the impact shaking the jars on the shelves. "It's over," Michelle growled, his face inches from the terrified shopkeepers. "I know everything." "I don't know what you're talking about," Thomas stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. "My wife found your map," Michelle said, his voice low and menacing. "She knew you were trying to steal my land. You and Daniel Dawson." At the mention of her husband's name, Rosie stepped forward. "You killed her," she said, her voice trembling but clear, finding a strength she never knew she possessed. "I saw you. You spooked her horse and you used a rock." Martha shrieked. "Lies! She's a liar, a crazy, desperate woman." "Am I?" Rosie's gaze was like a laser pinning Martha in place. "Then where did I get this?" She pulled the silver locket from under her dress and threw it on the counter. It skidded across the wood, coming to a stop in front of Martha. The tiny scratch near the clasp was clearly visible. "Your husband gave that to me," Rosie said, her voice ringing with the power of the truth. "To keep me quiet." The color drained from Martha's face. She knew that locket. She had seen her husband with it after the accident. The final piece of the trap fell into place. Reverend Price stepped into the doorway of the store, and behind him stood the town sheriff. They had been waiting. They had heard every word. Thomas Consincade saw them and let out a desperate cry. He broke free from Michelle's grasp and made a run for the back door. But Michelle was ready. He tackled him, and the two men crashed to the floor in a shower of splintered wood and spilled sugar. The fight was brief and brutal. When it was over, Thomas Consincade was lying on the floor, beaten and sobbing, his web of lies and murder finally torn to shreds. The sheriff put him in cuffs, while Martha stood frozen, her face a mask of horrified disbelief. "And you," the sheriff said, turning to Martha, his voice cold as a winter grave. "You tried to poison him. We found the preserves. You're an accessory to murder." As they were led away in chains, the townspeople who had gathered outside the store watched in stunned silence. The woman they had scorned, the beggar they had ostracized, was not a villain. She was a survivor. And the man they had pitied as a broken widower was a quiet hero who had fought for the truth. Michelle and Rosie stood together in the wreckage of the store, the dust settling around them. It was finally over. The ghosts of the past had been faced, and justice had been served. They walked out into the afternoon sun, hand in hand. The stares that followed them now were not of scorn, but of awe and respect. They had faced down the darkest parts of their town and won. That night, back on the ranch, they stood on the porch, looking out at the vast star-dusted sky. Annie was asleep inside, safe and sound. The silence between them was no longer filled with suspicion or strategy, but with a quiet, profound peace. "Thank you," Rosie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life." "No," Michelle said, turning to look at her, his rugged face softened by the moonlight. "We saved each other's." He reached out and gently touched her face. This time it wasn't about protection or justice. It was something new, something that had been growing in the spaces between the fear and the anger. Something that had started with a simple loaf of bread, a single act of kindness in a world full of cruelty, had set in motion a chain of events that had uncovered a dark conspiracy and brought two broken souls together. It had reminded them that even in the deepest darkness, a single flicker of light, of dignity, of respect, can be enough to start a fire. The world is full of whispers and judgment, and it's easy to turn away from those in need. But sometimes the person you save might just be the one who ends up saving you. If you believe that a little bit of kindness can change the world, make sure you hit that subscribe button. You never know what story we'll uncover next.